Welcome back, everybody. I am Brandon, and today we got some serious Switch Pro rumors to talk about. But we'll get into all that and more on another episode of the shit you care about. So like I mentioned in the beginning there, it sounds like Bloomberg has some serious insider information on the screens that are going to be used in the rumored Switch Pro. According to them, they got some information from someone that's associated with Samsung, but of course they didn't want to release their information because, you know, they're leaking a bunch of Nintendo information. It works out pretty good for us because now we got a little bit more information on this thing that was totally just a myth before this article. So starting off the article, it sounds like Samsung will be manufacturing these OLED screens for the upcoming Switch Pro. If this is true, that would be pretty excellent. OLED screens have a very nice poppy contrast. Also, they should be using less power overall, so that could help with battery life a little bit, along with providing a smaller bezel or maybe not even one at all, which would be pretty on point with kind of the overall aesthetic of touchscreens nowadays. It's also rumored to output at 4K when connected to your TV or in docked mode, and a little bit more controversial news saying that the Switch is going to be running in 720p still in handheld mode. Personally, I think it's pretty silly to complain about your handheld running in 720p. You absolutely will not notice the difference. I think Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey kind of go to show that you don't need a game to be in 1080p to make it look good. Not to mention, on that small screen, you're not gonna notice. Even the most picky PC gamer out there is not going to notice their small 7-inch handheld being at 1080p or 720p, I assure you. That being said, the bigger upgrade in hardware could mean higher frame rates for bigger games. And in my opinion, I think that's really the important information here. I mean, I could really care less if when I'm playing in handheld mode on an airplane or something like that, if the game is in 1080p, as long as I'm getting really good battery life and also getting that 60 frames per second that most games are targeting nowadays. If you actually remember, around that time last year, the PlayStation and Xbox were rumored to be manufacturing their consoles for that holiday release, so it makes sense that they'd be getting shipments in, putting Switches together, and then kind of getting them on shelves in that time period. I do want to take a break to point out really quick that all of this information is not official by any means, so take everything you're hearing today with a grain of salt. In fact, there was an interview just last month with Shintaro Furukawa. I hope I got that right. Shintaro Furukawa? Furukawa? Fuck. I sound like an asshole.
Definitely an asshole, for sure.
Anyway, the president of Nintendo had an interview, I believe it was last month or so, saying that there was no plans to talk about a Switch Pro anytime soon. Obviously, there's a bunch of speculation around that, whether he was kind of like hinting at a new Switch Pro or, you know, just saying shit like that because, of course, he's keeping his mouth shut. He's the president of Nintendo. That wouldn't really be working in his favor if he, you know, leaked the fucking Switch Pro right now. Not to mention, they'd probably end up going with some sort of like Nintendo Direct to show that off, I would imagine, instead of just releasing it in like a, you know, a little interview. That all being said, it is coming from Bloomberg, who is a pretty reputable news source, and if anyone's gonna have like confidential ties to people in the business industry, I imagine it's gonna be them. Moving on, I imagine that they're trying to kind of squeeze themselves into this bubble, if you will, that PlayStation and Xbox have made for themselves. Not that Nintendo really needs to compete with PlayStation or Xbox. In fact, they've had one of their biggest quarterly earnings since like 2008, back when the Nintendo Wii was all the craze. And trust me, I remember I picked mine up on day one. That console sold so well because of how much it appealed to children, teenagers, and adults. Even your grandma could play Wii bowling with you and have a pretty good time. Obviously, now we kind of look back at that era of consoles as a little silly because of all the motion controls and Kinect movement and stuff like that. But we have to remember that at the time, that was like revolutionary. And obviously you see a lot of those similarities with the original Wii that you see in the Nintendo Switch. My point is, if Nintendo keeps moving in this direction and just adding new features onto the Switch, I mean, they could go for another 5 years. I mean, think about it with the DS. They made like 5 different iterations of that, and it was one of the most popular consoles ever. In fact, it might be the most popular console of all time, just based on how many units were sold, how many iterations it had, and how long it went on. Knowing Nintendo, they're trying to squeeze every little ounce out of this device. And once again, I just think releasing a nicer version of what they already have created here is gonna sell gangbusters. Not to mention, this is really good business for Samsung. According to the leakers, they have a surplus of rigid OLED screens just lying around because apparently they're making a bunch before this big semiconductor shortage that's kind of affecting PlayStation and Xbox right now. So not only is Samsung and Nintendo kind of making pretty good business relationships here, possibly for the future, they're also buying up this old stuff to make something new, which is very Nintendo of them. I can't be for certain because I was having an issue finding it on the internet, but I thought I remembered reading or seeing somewhere that Shigeru Miyamoto had used like old arcade CRTs they had lying around to actually like make Mario Bros. So it's pretty common for Nintendo to use stuff that's already available to them to make something new with it. That's always sort of been Nintendo's thing, make more with less. And I think that lends a little bit of credibility to the article here because a lot of this stuff is falling very closely in line with how Nintendo has done business in the past. Hey guys, so it's editor Brandon here saying that I did finally find the article or whatever I was looking for here. Because the pace of innovation in the realm of electronics was moving at a breakneck speed in the late 1960s, and due to the high level of performance incumbent companies already had in the field, Yokai decided the best way to go at it was to use what he called lateral thinking with withered technology, meaning the use of cheap simplistic technology in alternative creative ways. This mentality led him to participate in the creation of games like Donkey Kong, Mario, Kid Icarus, and Metroid. Also enabled him to create multiple hardware devices for Nintendo, one of which, along with his updated color screen version, is the third best-selling gaming console in history with sales of 118 million devices distributed worldwide. Once again though, take everything with a grain of salt. This is not official, and I mean, it all could end up being just total rumors. And one last thing, I do have a little bit of a bone to pick with this article. The author does mention that developers apparently have a hard time developing their games for docked 1080p and handheld 720p. I don't know if that's entirely accurate. I do think he more was meaning like it's hard for them to get the visual fidelity that they want running on the Switch. For instance, like The Witcher 3 looks god-awful on the Switch. Obviously, it's cool that it's on the Switch, don't get me wrong, but you know, like literally you could play any other version, it would be way better. I digress though. I did have a little bit of a hard time finding any evidence, or at least any developer talking in the open about how hard it is to develop a Switch game in 720p and 1080p. I did, however, find a Gamasutra article by Sterling Sellover. He's a developer over at Stingbot Games, talking about his issues with getting his game to run at 60 frames per second on the Switch. I think that is a lot more of the problem here. Don't get me wrong, I don't have any developer friends, and I'm sure this guy from Bloomberg, like, at least knows his shit enough to write an article about this, but I'm pretty sure most graphics processors don't really have a problem rendering at 720 or 1080p, especially if you're developing your game at 1080p. There's not really any reason that it should be more difficult to lower it to 720p. I could see if you were up-resing, maybe that could cause some issues. I think that 60 frames per second is really the key here. With faster hardware, obviously we're gonna get better resolutions, but more importantly, we're gonna get better performance. And that's what I'm really stoked about if these Switch Pro rumors are true. Let me know what you guys think about all these Switch Pro rumors kind of floating around out there. I do think this is some fairly solid evidence that we might be getting a Switch Pro later this year. I wouldn't count on it releasing in this holiday season, because obviously with the global pandemic going on, who fucking knows what's gonna happen? But once again, pretty solid evidence. Anyway, I'm Brandon. This was the episode of the shit you care about on these Switch rumors from Bloomberg that we saw in the last week or so. Like the video if you like what I do, subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more, and have a kick-ass week.